Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our online service this morning. As we're getting going, I have to tell you, I absolutely loved our Christmas in July songs. I don't know about for you, but I just, such a joy to hear those songs. And, sometimes we just play those once a year, and yet there's such good words in those. I love that Aaron said that in his welcome because he's so right. And in fact, it actually just reminded me we had a great opportunity to go away last week. Leah and myself got to go away on a week vacation with her mom and dad, and also with her brother and their family. And we hadn't seen them since Christmas 2019. So such a joy to visit with the kids and with Paul and Carrie. And as we were away, we actually had our own Christmas in July and exchanged some presents with the kids, and just such a great time together. So I absolutely loved that Christmas in July. Also wanted to mention, in case you weren't aware, we've been doing, I've been asking and we've been putting out notes about volunteers for a summer market. In the past, we've had a history of partnering with our community centers, and they are putting on every Thursday night a community market where they are selling produce to the community, and had asked us if we had any volunteers that might be able to help. So we had our first market, had our volunteer team out, and just thankful to each one who came. We're going to be volunteering for the next few weeks as well. We've got those filled. If you still want to help with that and haven't signed up yet, we could still use your help nearing the end of the summer. So the next two markets, August 5th and the 19th, are full. But there's another market after that, or two in September. So if you want to help, there is still space for that. Well, today we are digging back into the book of Matthew. And if you've been part of Pathway for any length of time, over the summers, we always take some time and study through one of the Gospels. And we take our time going through that. We first did the Gospel of John, and now we're on to the Gospel of Matthew. And we're going to be picking up today where we left off at the end of last summer. And so we're going to be studying Matthew 15 today. So if you have a Bible, you can pull that out. You can turn to Matthew 15, and we're going to be looking at that. As we go through this morning, if you have any questions, please feel free to text those to 519-893-2951. You can post those in the chat. That's maybe even the best way to get your questions in. Our chat monitors do such a great job of sending me whatever comes in there. So please, you can text them in there. And you can also send them to shane@pathwaycc.ca. Well, today we're going to be, as I said, looking at Matthew 15 and verses 21 to 39. We're going to start with verses 21 to 28. We've kind of going to break this into two chunks today. And so verses 21 to 28 of Matthew 15, if you're trying to find Matthew, if you have a paper Bible and you're not quite sure, it's the first book of the New Testament. And so we're going to turn there. Leaving that place, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to him, crying out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is suffering terribly from demon possession." Jesus did not answer a word. So his disciples came to him and urged him, "Send her away, for she keeps crying out after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." The woman came and knelt before him. "Lord, help me," she said. He replied, "It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to their dogs." "Yes, Lord," she said, "but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered, "Woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted." And her daughter was healed from that very hour. As I was preparing for this morning and reading through this story, I have to confess, this was a hard story to wrestle with. As I read this, I'm like, it just is so uncharacteristic of Jesus. It reminded me of, I was thinking about just when people don't act in the way that they normally do, and you just wonder what is going on. I remember when my dad actually got really sick with Crohn's years and years ago, and I didn't really know how bad it was. And I'll never forget one day I opened their bedroom door to see if he wanted any dinner, and my dad kind of just yelled at me like, "Close the door! I'm gonna be sick." And and I remember being very taken aback and thinking, what is going on? This is not like my dad. I mean, first of all, it's food. And if you know me at all, I take after my dad. We both love a good meal. And he was just like, he was gonna be sick and he shut the door. Anyway, it was just he's such a calm, kind of chill guy. And it was very surprising when it all happened. And I think when I read this story, my mind went to that, 'cause I'm like, this doesn't seem like Jesus. This Canaanite woman comes to Jesus needing help for her kid who is possessed by a demon, and Jesus ignores her. I mean, why did he go to this region if not for her? To give you a picture of where Jesus is, I think a map can sometimes be helpful to give us an understanding of what's happening in our text. And so let me just kind of hold this map up a little bit. Now, I have put a link in the chat. You can click on that. I'll take you to our Facebook page. And I've posted 2 or 3 maps there that you can have a peek at up close. But just so you get an idea, most of Jesus' ministry has been taking place on this side of Galilee. This is Galilee here, and the Sea of Galilee is right there at the bottom. And most of his ministry has been there. And now Jesus has made his way north to the regions of Tyre and Sidon. In our second story, he's actually going to come back down to this side of the Sea of Galilee, into the Decapolis. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But just to give an understanding, Jesus has now left Jewish territory. He's left that part of the Sea of Galilee and the area of Galilee where he's done most of his ministry. And he's now gone up north into Gentile territory. He's gone to the Gentile regions. So why did he go there if he had no intention of ever helping anyone? But there's something to me that's even more puzzling. Not only does it seem uncharacteristic, but what is even more strange to me is that Jesus has already helped Gentiles. This isn't his first encounter with a Gentile. In fact, in Matthew chapter 8, and we've talked about this story earlier on in our series, Jesus heals the servant of a centurion. But now he's ignoring, and then when he does speak to her, he gives this callous seeming answer to this woman. A woman pleading for Jesus to heal her child and demonstrating such great persistence. Not only that, but you also have the disciples there, and they're annoyed. They're saying to Jesus, send her away or liberate her. There's the word that's used there can actually mean those 2 things. One is to send away or to get rid of, but the other means to liberate or to set free. In other words, I think in that interpretation makes more sense to me based on Jesus' answer. Because after the disciples come and say, Jesus, like, send her away, I think part of the connotation here is like, give her what she wants and get rid of her because she's annoying us. Because that's what Jesus then responds. He says, it is not right for me to do this. I was sent to the lost sheep of Israel. In other words, I'm not going to do what you're asking me to do because she's not one of the lost sheep of Israel. The disciples want Jesus to heal the daughter so the woman will leave them alone, but he's not going to do that. And as I was reflecting on this and reading about this, something came up that I had not really thought about before. There's an interesting part of this story that I think sheds light on why Jesus responds in a way that we think is so different than Jesus would typically respond. Matthew is clear at the beginning that this is a Canaanite woman. In other words, she is not an Israelite. She is not Jewish. She is Canaanite. She doesn't worship the God of Israel. She's a Canaanite woman, a Gentile woman. And yet, as Jesus comes close, do you notice what she says to him? She cries out in a Jewish sounding title. Son of David, she says. Son of David, have mercy on me. Lord, Son of David. She uses an honorific title to Jesus, a Jewish sounding title. It's interesting because the same thing happens actually in Matthew chapter 9. Two blind men are coming after Jesus, asking for him to save them. And if you remember back to the story, what do they cry out? Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us. But Jesus isn't going to respond to her in the same way he didn't to them. And I think a big piece of this is that it's not because she's a Gentile. That's not what's going on here. It's not, oh, that woman's a Gentile, so I'm not going to help her. Jesus has already, as I mentioned, healed a Gentile. But I think that Jesus doesn't respond because she comes pretending. As Rodney Reeves puts it in his commentary, Jesus has already helped Gentiles. This was no different, except that here we have a woman trying to talk like someone she is not. Jesus wants us to come to him as we are. With the centurion, there was no hiding who he was. He was a centurion soldier. He comes to Jesus and he asks Jesus to heal his servant. But here, this Canaanite woman comes using Jewish titles, honorific titles, hoping to appear as something she wasn't. And you might say, but wait a minute, you just said this was a Gentile region. That's true, but there were a lot of Jews who also lived in this region. Jews who had left parts of Israel to go north at different seasons of time. And what seems to be happening here is that Jesus has gone up there and she has come to him, but not come to him as a Gentile, not come to him in her true identity, but has come pretending to be someone else, hoping to curry Jesus' favor. And so Jesus' actions and his words, I think, are designed with the explicit purpose of exposing her duplicity. She's trying to act Jewish, but she isn't. And so when she finally gets his attention, he finally responds to her. She kneels before him. Lord, please heal me. Jesus says this statement, and it seems so callous. He says, it's not right to give the children's bread to the dogs. After she keeps begging and keeps persisting, Jesus now uses this analogy of dogs. And it was common for Jews to refer to Gentiles as dogs. And so I think what Jesus is doing is not putting down her ethnicity, but he is calling out her true identity. He's saying to her, woman, I know who you are. It reminded me of Jesus' interaction with the woman at the well. When she comes to him and Jesus eventually says, hey, bring me your husband. She says, I don't have a husband. And he says, that's true. You've spoken true. Because the man you're living with isn't your husband and you've had 5 other husbands. Jesus wants this woman to acknowledge her true identity. And it's only after Jesus points out that it isn't right to feed the dogs what is belonging to the children that this woman acknowledges her true station. She doesn't say, wait a minute, but Jesus, I am a child from your table. Please help me. I think as soon as Jesus says it, she understands that Jesus knows exactly who this woman is. And finally, she acknowledges her true identity, saying, but even dogs need crumbs. You're right, Jesus. You know who I am. But I need crumbs from you. As Laura Copley points out, in an act of faith, the Canaanite woman responds with, I'll take the crumbs. Maybe I'm not seated at the table, but I know there's mercy enough for me. I know there's power enough in just a crumb of your grace to take care of my daughter's demon possession. And I think that's why Jesus finally then commends her faith, her persistence, but also her humility and her willingness to see herself in the parable and to acknowledge that all she needs is a crumb, and that is enough. Jesus wants us to come to him as we are, not pretending to be something we're not acting like we've got it all together so he'll listen to us. It's not a barter system. Jesus wants us as we are. And when we come that way, he responds. Let's carry on in our passage. Matthew 15, 29 to 39. Jesus left there, and he went along the Sea of Galilee, then went up on a mountain and sat down. Now, I mentioned that this is going to be on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee in the Decapolis, and we know this because Mark actually also shares this story in chapters 7 and 8. He parallels these same stories that Matthew shares. And Mark tells us that this takes place in the Decapolis. And it says, then great crowds came to him, bringing the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others, and they laid them at his feet, and he healed them. The people were amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the cripple made well, the lame walking, the blind seeing, and they praised the God of Israel. Jesus called his disciples and said, I have compassion for these people. They've already been with me 3 days and have had nothing to eat. I do not want to send them away hungry, or they may collapse on the way. His disciples answered, where could we get enough bread in this remote place to feed such a crowd? How many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. 7, they replied, and a few small fish. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. Then he took the 7 loaves and the fish, and when he had given thanks, he broke them and gave them to disciples, and they in turn to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and afterward the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was 4,000, besides women and children. After Jesus had sent the crowd away, he got into the boat and went to the vicinity of Magadan. As Jesus leaves Tyre and Sidon, he heads south to the east side of the Sea of Galilee. And this is, as I mentioned, the Decapolis. And in many ways, when we read a story like this, I don't know about for you, but it sounds and feels very familiar to the feeding of the 5,000, which just took place in Matthew 14. I think that's why it can be easy to find a story like this and just almost skip over. It's like, yeah, I've already read this story. Okay, there's 1,000 less people and a different number of fish and a different number of leftovers, but isn't it basically the same? A big crowd, no food. The disciples don't know what to do. So Jesus takes inventory, gets the crowd to sit down. He blesses the food. They all eat. There's leftovers. Isn't it just the same? But there's something here, a couple things that I find very strange. And I'm not sure if it hit you or not, or if you've ever thought about this or not. Maybe you have. But as I read, I couldn't help but wonder if just one chapter ago, in Matthew 14, Jesus fed 5,000 men besides women and children with a small lunch. Excuse me. Isn't it odd that the disciples are now befuddled as to what they should do? It seems to me, since they had just witnessed the same miracle, maybe a few months before, because after that, Jesus goes north. He spends some time in Tyre and Sidon where he meets the Canaanite woman, and likely there are other things that happen there too. Then he comes back down south, far side, he's at the Decapolis. You might be talking a few months, whatever. But they're not going to forget that miracle. And it seems so strange to me that if they had seen that miracle just a few months before, and Jesus says, I want to have compassion on them. I don't want to send them away hungry where they might faint, that one of the disciples ought to have sprung to action and been like, okay, Jesus, we'll gather up some food. You do your thing. Let's feed these people. But that's not the response. Instead, they're like, okay, but where are we going to get bread in this remote place for all these people? Why did the disciples not know what to do? Had they forgotten the miracle already? That seems unlikely to me. But it begs the question, what is going on here? I mean, I'll be honest, I'm not the brightest bulb in the box, but I'd like to think that if 6 months after I saw an enormous miracle of Jesus feeding a bunch of people, and then Jesus says, I want to feed this another enormous group of people, it seems to me I'd be like, oh, okay, let's go get some lunches and give it to Jesus. He obviously can make this happen again. And yet that's not their response. And while I don't know for sure that this is why the disciples responded they did, I cannot help but wonder if their response to Jesus is not about the location. You see, the Decapolis, that eastern side of the Sea of Galilee, was a Gentile region. These people that were being healed were Gentiles. Jesus has welcomed them. Remember, he's gone there once and they kicked him away. He went to the Decapolis and healed Legion, the man with the demons. And Jesus healed him, and the demons went in the pigs, and then they asked him to leave. But Jesus has now come back, and my guess is due to the influence of Legion and maybe hearing other stories, they're now gathering and flocking to Jesus. They're bringing him their sick, and he's healing them, and he's caring for them. And now Jesus is going to feed them. And why I think the disciples were not okay with this, or maybe struggled with this, or maybe didn't want to see this happen, or maybe didn't think it could happen, is because when we think of the feeding of the 5,000, that story is designed to evoke within us memories of Moses and the manna from the book of Exodus, where bread is provided for all of Israel. And that picture was designed to remind people of the coming feast that people would eat at the table of God as he established his kingdom. It was designed to remind people of the prophet Elijah, who fed 100 men with just 20 small loaves. And when it was to Jewish people, I think the disciples were amazed and excited about this. Yeah. You know, they gather up 12 baskets of leftovers, and 12 baskets of leftovers were symbolic of the 12 tribes of Israel. It's like, yes, yeah, Jesus, he's the new prophet. He is the Messiah, is what they're going to come to believe. And I think they're excited about that because it's for Israelite people. But these people were not Jewish. They were not participators in the manna. They were Canaanites. They were Canaanites. And I think the disciples did not think they deserved to participate in God's feast. It's one thing for Jesus as the prophet in the steps of Moses and in the steps of Elijah to feed the people of Israel. It is another thing for him to feed the Gentiles, because that would be symbolic of the kingdom expanding to all people. My guess is that this was a hard thing for the disciples to watch in the case of the healings and now the feedings, because it was clear that Jesus was not just about Israel. In the story of the feeding of the 5,000, we have 12 baskets of leftovers, and most scholars would suggest that the 12 was representative of the 12 tribes of Israel, and again, it's symbolic of Jesus leading the whole nation of Israel, and that he was going to be the one to restore. And similarly, we have 7 baskets gathered here. And when you go back to the book of Exodus, and it talks about the conquering of the promised land, there are listed there 7 nations of the Canaanites. In Exodus, we read of the 7 Canaanite nations: the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Perizzites. See, this was the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham that through him all nations would be blessed. As Michael Wilkins puts it, he says, if the number of 12 baskets left over in the feeding of 5,000 is symbolic of Israel, as most suppose, then the number 7 here, which is normally symbolic of perfection or completion, symbolizes the completion or fullness of God's meeting the needs of all peoples, now including the Gentiles. See, I wonder if the disciples' amnesia, their forgetfulness as to how Jesus might feed all these people, was not about their forgetting the feeding of the 5,000, but more because they found it hard to see God's grace, his banquet table, extended to outsiders. I wonder if it was hard for the disciples to see these Gentiles, these unclean and ungodly people, participating in God's feast. The feeding of the 5,000 in Israel made sense. I mean, Jesus was a prophet to Israel. But now he's doing this for the Gentiles. How can this be? And there's this wonderful truth in this story that God's grace is extended to all. The story reminds us that Jesus came to offer grace to all people so that in him there is neither slave nor free, Greek nor Jew, male nor female. In Jesus, all are now invited to participate in the feast. And while I think we celebrate this, I think today I can say this, and most of you probably are at your homes going, yeah, of course we believe that. Yeah, I've heard it a million times. Grace for all, of course. That's the good news of the gospel. And while I think we would say that, I sadly think there are many times that we are much more like the disciples than we choose to admit. Where we are like the disciples, fancying ourselves the gatekeepers of who gets grace and of how grace works. I think there's an arrogance sometimes that comes with our faith, a pride of creating a fence of who is in and who is out. And while I think it's clear, Jesus is very clear that not everyone will receive his grace. The last I checked, he didn't make me the guardian or judge of who those people are. And as I read this story, and as I came to see, oh man, like this happens in the Gentile regions, and the disciples are actually potentially not wanting to remember because they don't want to extend God's feast to all people. I was convicted of the times in my life where I have been slow to offer grace to those who look different, who act different, who think different. This truth that God's grace is extended to all, I think, is both freeing and convicting. It's freeing because it means, wow, like God offers his grace to me, a sinner, somebody far from him, a Gentile. But it's also convicting because even as a Gentile, we can quickly become so similar to the disciples, not extending the grace that God has given to us to others. Remember, Jesus heals these people and he feeds them and he offers them. But not all these people are going to follow him. Many people abandon Jesus in the coming days. But it doesn't stop Jesus from offering his grace, from extending his grace. And that's the call to us, isn't it? Isn't our call to extend the overflowing grace that we've received to those around us? And whether they choose to respond or not, whether they ever choose to follow Jesus or not, is not up to us. That is between them and God. But we are called to love the world around us, to extend God's grace to the world around us. And that includes things like feeding people, caring for people, inviting people into our homes who may be different than us, who may think different than us, who may live different than us, who may even have a different religious system than us. But we don't get to be the determiners of who gets God's grace and who doesn't. And a story like this should always cause us to bring that into question. As we close today, let me just give you a couple of takeaways. One takeaway in particular this morning. Extending God's grace, just following up on this thought. The disciples had missed this point, that we are called to be extenders of God's grace. They saw Jesus feed the 5,000, but they didn't want to extend God's grace to the Gentiles. And truth is, it didn't happen instantaneously after this story. It's not like, oh, Jesus healed all these people and fed 4,000, so now we have to be extenders of grace to the Gentiles. It still takes them some time to get this truth. In the book of Acts, we have this story of Peter, and he's in Joppa, and he's on the roof, and God has to give him this vision 3 times to say, stop calling things unclean that I have deemed clean. And the whole parable of this vision that Peter sees is that God has now opened the kingdom to the Gentiles too. And so Peter goes to their home and he tells them about Jesus, and they receive the Spirit, and he says, now I know. It doesn't happen instantly for the disciples, that they immediately become great grace givers to the Gentile people. But I think that the shift happens because as they followed Jesus, they began to practice extending grace. Whether it was through healing people, through going to remote places, meeting with the Gentiles. As they practiced it, they became grace givers. And so as we go about our life this week, my encouragement to you is to be a grace giver, to extend God's grace this week. Now, I don't know what that means for you, but my prayer is that God would reveal to you a way that you can do this week, a practical way. Maybe there's somebody that you've been holding on to something against, and you need to offer them forgiveness, and you need to extend them grace. Maybe there's somebody you've put off phoning for a while for whatever reason. And maybe for you, it's that this week you need to pick up that phone and make that call, extending grace. Maybe there's someone who you know needs your help, and you've been putting off helping them for whatever reason, and this week is your chance to reach out and help them. Maybe there's somebody who you felt like you should invite to dinner or invite to hang out in your backyard or whatever. And maybe you kind of were feeling that, but then COVID happened and that became a reason not to. And maybe you're still nervous about that. Find another way. But if God is leading you to extend grace, don't say no. And if you can't think of anything specifically, maybe you're just going, nothing is coming to my mind. Then this week as you go, make your prayer simply this: God, open my eyes and reveal how I can practice extending your grace this week. Open my eyes and show me how to practice extending grace. Because if we're going to become good grace givers to the people around us, it's going to take effort. Let me pray, and then we'll close this morning. Father, we thank you for this message today. And God, I confess I've read these scriptures many times and glossed over them, feeling like it's the same story as the feeding of the 5,000. And yet I think there is a profound message for us. That God, we too often can be just like the disciples, guardians of grace in a way that we are not free with it. And yet you've been so free with us, giving us your grace where we don't deserve it. And so God, help us to release this sense that we have to protect the grace that you've given, and let us offer it freely. And whether people respond or don't respond is not up to us, it's up to you and them. It's between them and you. But God, may we never be shutting people out of your kingdom. May we never be turning away people who we could show you to by showing our love to them. And so God, help us. Help us be grace extenders this week as we recognize our identity as grace receivers. God, help us to practice giving grace this week. Reveal to each one who's watching now and who will watch throughout the course of this week, reveal to them the area where you want them to practice grace giving this week. Show each of us, Lord, and maybe there's something we've been putting off or holding off on that we need to do, and maybe it's something new that you want to do in us. But either way, open our eyes and help us to tune our hearts to what you want to do. In Jesus' name, amen. I'm just going to double check that we have no questions this morning, and then we're going to wrap up. It doesn't look like we have questions. So thanks for joining us today. It's been great to worship together. As we go, just want to remind you and encourage you that we are having a special Zoom lobby today. We're only doing 2 of these through the summer, so I highly encourage you to connect with us and be participating in these Zoom lobbies. It's a lot of fun to see each other, and our theme for today is vacations, just to give us a little bit of framework for our conversation. So as part of that, we're going to talk about memory of our favorite vacation, whatever that looks like, and we're also going to talk a little bit about our favorite or our dream vacation. Where is it that you would love to go? So I hope to see you in there. Thanks for tuning in with us today. Cannot wait to be together again. We're looking forward to our outdoor live services, as Murray mentioned in the welcome, and gearing up for the fall where we hope to be back together in person. I'll share more of that with you in the coming days as we hammer out some more of those details. But God bless you guys as you go, and hope to see you in the Zoom lobby. Have a good week, everyone.